We're so excited to unpack Prof Marius Ungerer's latest book, Afro-global Management Innovation Practices. Hi, Prof Marius. Welcome to today's event. Just a few housekeeping rules before we delve into the subject matter. So the first hour of the event will actually delve into the subject matter, after which we'll have a short 15-minute section for Q&A where you'll be able to engage with the panel and share your insights and ask critical questions. Apart from that, we just ask that you please keep yourself muted throughout the panel discussion, and please feel free to pop your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as we go forward, and then we'll address those towards the end. With that, I'm very excited to introduce, for those of you who don't already know, our author, Prof Marius Ungerer. So Prof Marius Ungerer is a University of Stellenbosch Business School stalwart. He's been at the business school for 15 years and has written over 11 books in his time as an academic member of society. Prof Ungerer has also contributed and written several articles himself, and yes, he's an expert in strategy management. So welcome, Prof Ungerer.
Thank you very much, Adwa, and thank you for joining this webinar.
Yes, thanks, Prof. So, Prof, before we invite our two other panel members to engage with you, there are two key questions that I wanted to pose to you. The first being, why did you write this book? And then secondly, can you tell us a little bit about the way that you've structured the content, so the chapter sequence of the book?
Yes, thank you for that question. This is the result of 3 years of focused collaborative research. So I've always been interested in the broad subject matter of innovation, but around about 2016, I realized that innovation isn't only about technical innovation, but there is something called managerial innovation. And in 2019, with Davida Bay's MBA student, we've initiated a study on managerial innovation practices in an organization in South Africa, and that was the start of the whole research process underpinning the book. So in 2020, I solicited 8 more MBA students to do specific research in organizations meeting the criteria that we set. And then in 2020, I've also initiated a separate study on the relationship between the key components of managerial innovation, and we will perhaps talk a little bit about that later. And I've also in 2020, through digital interaction, interviewed people in Kenya and people on the west side of Africa to sort of get a broad base of companies and their views on what they're doing in this domain. So in 2021, the writing actually started, and I was lucky to solicit both Johan Harold and Anton Slachter to sort of assist with 2 of the chapters in the book. And of course, I had the wonderful thesis finished by that time of 9 MBA students, plus all the interviews that I did myself, a total of 60 interviews, plus also the results from the empirical study on the relationship of the key variables. So I was then ready to start to sort of unpack and write the book. And in my mind, it is a fulfillment then of an interest area for myself, but also, yeah, very much based on data from the continent, and that is being juxtaposed against what is already available in the international market, and therefore the title then Afro-global perspective, etc. So on your second question, the sequence, so there's 12 chapters, 5 themes. Theme 1 about the context and the sort of drivers of the change and that influence work and work places. Then the second theme about the global benchmarks, and there's chapters on the leadership agenda, the workplace agenda, the corporate citizen agenda. Then the third theme is the research base for the book. So reporting on both the quantitative and the qualitative research database and introducing the reader to that. And then the fourth part is 4 chapters on what are companies in Africa doing already on managerial innovation. So that is the fourth one. And the fifth one is if one then wants to think about change and planning a change and an organization development process, how would that look like? What would be the main elements of that? So that's the logic of the flow of the book.
Thanks, Prof. And I think with that, you've whet the audience's appetite and they're getting really excited to hear how the panel engages with one another. But before that, I think it's time to introduce our other 2 panel members. So we have Prof Mark Smith. As you know, Prof Mark Smith is currently the director at the Stellenbosch Business School. And Prof Mark Smith, apart from being the director, is also a seasoned academic and has done multiple, has basically contributed to and written multiple articles himself. He's contributed to a wide range of topic areas, including employment legislation, as well as gender. Welcome, Prof Mark. Okay. Hi, Prof. Okay, additionally, we have Dr. Armand Bam, or Bam, for our English speakers. And actually, Prof himself introduces himself in this manner. So Dr. Armand is actually the head of social impact at the business school and also currently lectures as a senior lecturer on our MBA program in the area of society, business and society. So welcome, Dr. Bam.
Thank you, Adwa. As Bam, English, Afrikaans, Xhosa, and all the other official languages.
Okay, so Dr. Bam has set the record straight. So we've ruled out Bam and we can stick to, we've ruled out Bum, excuse me, and we can stick to Bam. Thanks, Doctor, for that. So now that we've got all our panel members in the discussion, I think we can start with the meat of why we're here today. I've got my first question, and of course, I've saved the first for our author. And it is in chapter 1, you introduce some major contextual change drivers that will influence our future way of working. Can you share some of these major trends with us? And can you also explore the possible impacts that these will have on work and workplaces of the future?
Yeah, so in chapter 1, we try to sort of themes that is impacting work and workplaces. So the first obvious one is COVID, and the direct effect is the way that we work, the work from home impact. But of course, COVID's got more than other influences also, and that is the whole sort of challenge of digital teamwork, and of course the whole challenge of personal isolation. But on the other side, it is also impacting how we think about supply chains and the positioning of supply chains as beneficial in-time delivery for meeting customer needs. So that's the first one. But the second one is sort of combination of external factors. And if I can mention a few, the whole trend of deglobalization, and that's in effect a reaction to the supply chain dilemmas that we have. We see a movement on a backlash on democracy, which will influence the workplace. Of course, the rise in sovereign debt and of individual debt, environmental disruptions, rising nationalism. But what the cumulative effect of this is that it impacts, unfortunately, negatively on the future economic prospects from a global perspective. So that's the second sort of trend. The third one, everybody knows about this, fourth industrial revolution, and it's about the continuing new technologies that's being introduced in the work environments, the effect of those new technologies, but of course the man-machine interaction challenges and the ethics associated with that development. Clearly a direct impact on the work environment. The fourth one is the new reality of a workforce, the composition of the workforce. And we are now entering and is already in the time where we have 4 generations working side by side in the workplace. Now that is, I mean, we've never seen this before, and therefore we can't sort of ignore that reality. And then lastly, the fifth one is there's a definite push to more flexible workplace practices, but not in terms of whether I work from home. It is more in terms of the type. So you've got a permanent core, and then you've got this flex professional contributors. And there's new names emerging for them called gig workers. And clearly that composition is affecting how we think about the workforce that we are managing in the organization. So there are multiple forces that is influencing the nature of work and workplaces in organizations. And that was the sort of, it's just the introduction, but there's nothing, I mean, groundbreaking about that. It's just that is the reality of the context, and the reality is we can't ignore this. It's there.
Thanks, Prof. And I think that we can actually see this from a business school perspective. When we're in the classroom and we're teaching about certain subject matters, we can see that this COVID essentially filters through towards all the examples that we're exploring currently. With that, Prof Smith and Dr. Bam, I invite you to contribute and share your insights with regards to this question.
Thanks, Adwa. Thanks, Marius. I think in a way, Marius is a little bit modest there and saying it's nothing novel in terms of thinking about those contextual elements, because sometimes we find in management research, particularly that might come from the Northern Hemisphere and maybe a bit over towards the West, there's kind of a universalistic perspective where they don't consider these contextual dimensions, and there's one best way, and everything is kind of a certain model that might be applicable in all places. And I think what you do in the outset of the book is outline the importance of context, the importance of those different groups of workers that we face, the importance of the changing nature of supply chains or the changing economic environments that are very relevant in Africa, but anywhere in the world. And I think there's a certain honesty about that, but also that does make the book a little bit different in that sense, because you do underline that contextual side of things. And particularly, I would say, for myself, somebody who's very interested in employment and generations and gaps and inequalities, I think you do underline ultimately how employment is very important. Work is what we do every day. We spend a lot of our time doing that, and that's why it's important. But also, it impacts upon the way that economies look and the way societies look. The other thing I think you do, and this coming to my question, there's a typical long academic question, is I think you have two sort of underlying frames of thinking, abundance thinking and paradox thinking. And I think that for me, I think that's also different because there's a sort of underlying positiveness about abundance thinking compared to the negative approach of perhaps zero sums and competition, etc. So I'd like to ask you to you use these two ways of thinking to think about why and how we reinvent work and workplaces. But I'd like to ask you to sort of explain or elaborate a little bit more about why you think they're important.
Yeah. Look, there's a by-title of the book, and it's Reimagine. And we cannot reimagine if we can't think outside the boxes. And to do that, we need to have at least a healthy optimism. And I've found abundance thinking as a way into that space. And abundance thinking help us to sort of create more opportunities, to create alternatives for what we are facing. But abundance thinking is based on one very big fundamental departure point, and that is a belief that in most cases, the future will be better than what we think. So living into that opportunity space with that mindset allows us to sort of reimagine things, and that's what they also call upward spiral thinking and building onto each other. The other side of that is paradox thinking, and that is the ability to have two truths in the same time and space and held that up together. Now, fundamentalists can never do this. They choose between one thing or another thing. But here in a paradox thinking, we embrace the brilliance of the and. It is putting things together, which again allows you to work with seemingly opposing forces in the same. But that is what complexity asks from us. We cannot just ignore or eliminate factors to make life and thinking for us easy. So an example of that type of paradox is change and stability. So we want to reinvent how we think about work, reinvent how we think about workplaces. What we need things, certain things need to be kept stable. That's the stability part. And in the book, we argue very much for a values-based orientation and also a purpose-based departure point. Those are the things that's kept stable. But on the other side, to have this reinvention, you have to have change. And it's about managing that healthy tension between those two things. But we also make the argument that you need both leadership and you need good management. It's not the one or the other. You need both of those things in the same time and space to excel. So therefore, abundance thinking and paradox thinking, a core thinking frame to sort of help us to enter into this fairly complex and challenging domain.
Thanks. I would say, sorry, just to say, I'd say you were. It's not really. It's just a comment that you're both fortunate that the book is coming out at the end of this first period of COVID, because I think that actually demonstrates many of those things you talk about, the need to look for a more positive future, but also the need to deal with complexity is underlined even more so than it was in March 2020 before we were there. Sorry, Armand.
No, thanks, Rob. So just, Prof, just to come back, the things that impressed me about the book was speaking to that issue of context, the Africanness of it. And if we have time to go into just discussing a little bit of that. But beyond that, throughout the book, one gets a sense that there is this promotion of social cohesion through organizations, and you spoke a little bit about the values.
So ladies and gentlemen, whilst we wait for Dr. Bam to rejoin, I'm going to actually ask Prof Smith to pick up, because this is an area that he's also very familiar with. So Prof, if you don't mind tag teaming with Dr. Bam and picking up that conversation. I'm
going to try and guess where he was going, but I am interested as leader of the business school and somebody who's very interested in management education in Africa. I think it's really important that we think about what we can learn about the African context, what's different, what's what's unique or for organizations, for managers, but also just as important, I think we should be proud as an African business school and as African academics and researchers, what the rest of the world can learn from the African context, because it's not a one-way street. There's lots of people talk about the future of the African economy, the demographic dividend, all of these things. But even without that sort of some of those things which maybe in the future, there are things to learn from these case studies, which and the research in this book, which goes both ways. So the question I would have asked, so hoping that I'm guessing where our man would have gone, is around what we learn particularly about Africa, and what also we perhaps can share with the rest of the world.
Great.
Well,
thanks, Prof.
Thank you, Mark, for that. I think the first contribution from the book, and then the perspective that's reflected in the book, is that we are management innovation has never been described in the way that it's being described in the book. So traditionally, management innovation has been seen as processes, practices, structures, and techniques, and transforming that to eventually have an effect on the competitiveness of the organization. And of course, it's to increase the competitiveness. And all the sort of current literature is in that definition. What we've done in the book is that we've used an ontology that is very old, but in the sense for applying it to the subject matter of management innovation, new. So we have positioned the results from the research in answering the questions: how do we plan in a new way? How do we organize in new ways? How do we lead in new ways? And of course, how do we introduce new controls that is absolutely empowering the majority, and not as the main current practice, the empowerment of structurally only a few. So that's the first what the rest of the world can learn. Secondly, from all of the case studies, and the summation of that is that the human centricity as a key departure point. And that plays out into different things that these companies are doing. But to mention three things, the first is that, I mean, they have a deep care for people. So people first, and accepting people as the key resource, not only as a good sort of statement, but as a practiced reality. Then accepting that people want to be developed, and they want to develop their full potential, and creating that opportunity. And also aligning their personal purpose with the purpose of the organization, which then empowers the third outcome. And that is that these companies are all about a force for good, making a contribution beyond just sort of the widgets, but also the widgets is contributing to making the world a better place. So that's the second thing, I think, what the rest of the world can learn from this. And the third one is a reprioritization, a clear reprioritization of stakeholders. Now, we all know that there is this movement from shareholder to stakeholders, but the sort of unanswered question, and the book gives a very specific position on this, that there is a priority in this stakeholder prioritization, and the organizations are showing it in their practices. The first one is it's people first, and then it's customers, and then it is shareholders. And the logic sounds like this: if you want happy customers, you need to have happy people to serve them. and to create products and services that would enlighten them. So that's the first logic why it's about people. And you have to have people who are excited, who wants to sort of enlighten the experiences of customers. But then, of course, we all know that customers who get what they want, they come back for more and they tell all the others. And of course, that then creates shareholder value. That then creates the financial return. So the companies that is being reported on in the book have clearly, this is the third contribution, that there is a clear pattern emerging on companies that is reprioritizing the stakeholders and the logic of the interaction of the stakeholders. So yeah, that's the three sort of, I think, main differences and contributions that the book can make.
I just want, for people who haven't read the book yet, that Marius has a nice phrase about companies doing good and doing well, and I think that captures that sense of both purpose and being good at what you do. So, but I'll hand back to our man now. He's here.
Apologies. It seems like technology just decided to leave me there. But I was making the point that in reading the book, the notion of the context, I think that comes through quite strongly, and I think that was refreshing to read. And then the underpinning, you know, the development or promotion of social cohesion through organizations, and you've just spoken now about being people-centered again. And so my question really was, you know, why is it, or why should we change the way that we manage?
Okay. I think you are also making a point on social cohesion as a necessary condition for organizational success and for societal success. So why should we sort of change the way that we manage? Well, the first reality is historical reality, that we are doing the same things for 60 years plus. So fundamentally, management and the way that management is being talked about and being exercised in practice hasn't changed for the last 60 years. Now, clearly that can't hold, because that is creating a big mismatch between what people expect and what people actually get from work and from workplaces. So clearly there's this expectation gap. Now we all know that this 21st century is about talent, and talent flock to places where they actually get not that big mismatch, but actually a perfect match. And I want to share a story with you about what the companies are doing to sort of do that match. But continuing with the question, why should we change the way that we manage? This isn't just about peripheral changes. So having hip offices, foosballs and things in the playrooms, in the office environments, which we see sort of, this isn't about that type of change. This is about a fundamental rethink about work and what work constitutes. And what we're trying to sort of do with the book is to show people that work can actually be much more fulfilling than what we generally think. And yes, these trailblazing organizations are making it possible for people to absolutely thrive in their individual capacity, but also as respected community contributors in a societal sense. Let me share a story about one of the Kenyan organizations, and the organization is Centum. It's a financial orientated company focusing on investments, but also they have their own ventures part also. So they told me that, I mean, the majority of their workforce are millennial people. So it's young people, well educated, minimum 4 years of post-matric training, many of them with masters, and most of them continuing with further professional studies. And of course, they support all of that. But listen to this, what they are doing to sort of make the employee value proposition attractive for these millennials, and not talking down to their lifestyle and their choices and their ambitions, but acknowledging that. So they know that these younger people do sort of have late nights, and then they are sort of, there's no time for a breakfast, and then they arrive at work, not that sort of with full strength to work. So what they've decided, they give people a breakfast. And it's not like this sort of oily breakfast, it's a healthy breakfast. They also have nutritional people sort of monitoring their people. And of course, they also give them lunch. But they see these all as conversation opportunities. And that's where the sort of first interactions in a day start. Now, a free breakfast and lunch, that's not such a big deal. They all want to develop, so they are very supportive of their tertiary further continuous development. But these people, they have high aspirations for driving a smart car, quick, and a flashy car. So what Centum is doing is that they make finances available, car finance at a discounted rate, so that these younger generation can buy a car much smarter than their peer group. Now, that of course keep people and attract people. Then fourthly, they also, when they have developments in property, they keep a certain percentage of the property for their employees, and they give them a discounted price on the property. So most of these youngsters also then own property much larger and bigger and smarter than any of their peer groups. But then, of course, there's also young families, and in Nairobi, there's public school system and a private school system, just as in South Africa. And where do these people want to send their children? Not to public schools, to private schools. And they say that's fine. So they've made a corporate deal with the private school in Nairobi, where children from the employees from Centum get a special discount. You see, this is what what I'm talking about. Why should we change? Because the needs of the people that we're working is fundamentally different, and we cannot just say, oh, because it's different now, now we can ignore it. So this is for me an example of a company that is really sort of renewing the way that they think about their people as a core asset.
Thanks, Prof. Just to you mentioned this intergenerational gap of sorts, and we have the book here, so just to further punt it, I suppose, the relevance to, if I would put it this way, the older generation of managers. Is this something that everybody should now have, not only on their coffee table, but on their desks to assist them, and will it assist them to deal with that intergenerational gap, as you alluded to.
Yeah, look, this is not a specialized book on generation theory. A person like Graham Kotikinen here in South Africa is writing very specifically on that topic for the last 15, 20 years already. So we are just sort of in the contextual chapter referring to these generations, but I can see that as from the story that I've just told, that the organizations are very much aware of sort of the needs. And in that sense, yes, Armand, a manager can benefit from the examples that's there to play into the needs, the variety of needs of a changing workforce. But it's in a multiple spectrum of activities. Let's just sort of also say it very early. There's no like magic wand, there's no magic formula, there's no one magic thing. This is about a concerted effort, and it needs to be on the strategic agenda of the organization. Not only, what I see a lot is innovation, but when most organizations talk about that innovation, they talk about their technical innovation, they talk about new products and services. But managerial innovation also needs to be part of the strategic agenda. And only if we're going to see that more and more comes to the fore, when there's a conscious drive to reinvent work and reinvent workplaces to be truly human-centric, then we are sort of moving forward. So yes, of course, I want managers to buy the book and to empower themselves, because that's the name of the game. This is a self-help game.
Thanks, Marius. I think back to your point about what this book is not, I'm happy with the direction that you're moving into, because that was one of the questions that I was going to ask you about. But with that, I'm going to take it a step back. So we've spoken about management innovation, we've spoken about the difference between the two, but why is it so important? And you have touched on this, but why is it so important that we change the way that we manage?
Well, this is it's an under-researched area in the first instance, so not much research has been done on this. When Gary Hamel did a survey about 3 years ago, he sort of got the numbers of managerial innovation publications versus technical innovation publications. So, but then if there isn't a theoretical base for this, then of course the practice also lack, and one see that in general that there is a low appetite for this type of practice. And one can, I've got views on why there is such a low appetite, not only in the academic environment, but in the practical environment. And that is because I don't think that, and of course, this is not all the people watching this webinar. I'm not talking about you, I'm now of course talking about other people. And that is, in general, managers are, their blind spot is a philosophical departure point for the work that they do and the way that they think about work and workplaces. So when everyone is sort of changing the discussion from action, results, and say, but what is the principle at play? What is the sort of values that we, and how will this value now manifest in a practical way? Then the participant enthusiasm for making contributions around that dwindles. And one of the things that we need to get right to, as a sort of precondition for this development, is consciousness development. because consciousness, a higher level of consciousness on an individual level and on an organizational level, helps us to manage more complex situations. And therefore, a big intervention as part of the organization development part would be a deliberate attempt to inquire and think about how we think.
Great, thanks, Marius. I see Prof. Mark Smith smiling, so I think, Mark, it seems as though you have something to say.
Yeah, well, the philosophical underpinning that Marius mentioned, and the perhaps the absence of that in a lot of managers' thinking, it's very present in the book. You mentioned earlier that you go back to a lot of old ways of thinking in terms of coordination, control around leadership, around management, sorry, but you also you pull on philosophy for when you think about the different types of leadership that you pull out, and you particularly, and so you particularly lean on this idea of the virtuous leadership, and that's what you carry forward into the empirical side of the research in the first phase of the empirical side. So I wonder what the differentiating factors of virtuous leadership for you, and why was that the one you took forward to? Because you took other legitimate approaches as well, but you really went with that one.
Yeah, well, labels are always problematic. So I was deliberately sort of shying away from the sort of overused labels. And virtuousness is an old wisdom in both Western thinking and in Eastern thinking. I've actually sort of started working on this virtuous leadership concept already in 2012 on a book that I published at that stage called Leadership for All, which reflects an abundance in its departure point, but the underlying philosophy is the one of virtuousness. Now, virtuousness represents the best of what we as humans can be. And that's for me a good strive, to be the best that we can be. And of course, the philosophers from the East and the West has sort of written about, so what is a wise person? What does a wise person do? What is the virtues of a good leader? And so it's those sort of old wisdoms that I'm tapping back onto, because there is also a trend in leadership practice and in research that character is the basis. And yes, with that, I sort of put with that the whole positive psychology departure point, that all of us have much more good in us than what we think and what we normally sort of get access to, and putting that ideal of a good person in our leadership sort of strive and in our modeling, that is for me a good departure point. But the other big reason is that the whole world is struggling with ethics. The whole world is struggling to where leaders, managers are being distrusted. And therefore we need to sort of have a new approach around this. And of course, trust is the basis for relationships and in organizations. But I want to make another point about the view that the book is reflecting on organizations, and that is, organizations are not machines. They are living systems, and they are made up of living people. And with that, to create that as a virtuous interacting system, that is what we are after, because that system can then self-organize self-adapt, but also always the result is for the best, is for the virtuous outcome.
Thanks. I'd say, Jill, I'd say if I've understood, something else I learned from the book or took from your approach is that also, even though you've underlined the importance of character in your answer there, we might associate character with the hero leader of the past and the great man, whereas actually you're very critical of that type of leadership because you're more about distributed leadership and that everybody has a leadership role, but also a positive sense that everybody has virtue as well, and there's everybody's trying to do a good job and a sort of trust in humanity thing.
Yeah, that's playing into the strengths departure point, that what we all have, we've got strengths. We just need to discover that, acknowledge that, accept that, appropriate that for ourselves, and then work with that, because that's the gift that we have. We all have strength, uniqueness, geniusness that we have. And that is what we bring to our teams. And that is what we bring to discussions. And to find the courage and to sort of work with that as our main contribution in teams, in the organization, and of course in society. But the book makes, I mean, a clear statement on a hero leadership approach is toxic for humanity's future. So that beast we can't feed anymore.
Marius, this part also excited me because I think as we've had the discussions, virtues of interest to me in the work that I also do. And I appreciate that focus on character. And so if we look at the contemporary writers around virtue and management and leaders, the push towards describing organizations as virtuous. And so not only the human person working in it, but organizations as virtuous organizations. Won't you just share a little bit with us? If we look at chapter 5, you take us towards the corporate citizenship agenda and the link between that virtuous developing the character within organizations. You've spoken about systems and this corporate citizenship agenda. What I picked up was, you know, and I don't know if it was purposeful, you spoke about corporate social responsibility and not investment. And so maybe if you want to give us some insight into that particular agenda and how it can be used to leverage the transformation of organizations. So really, what is the essence there of a corporate citizenship agenda as you've reflected or shared with us in the book?
Thank you, Armand, for that. So a corporate citizen agenda, the result of that is that the organization isn't promising, isn't making statement. It is virtuous in the sense that it is a force for good in nurturing the commons that it is part of and also the workplace that it controls. So it is that force for good. And Marco already says that we play with this, that you can be both good in terms of financial reward, but of course you can also be good in terms of a social return and contribution. Again, linking to the abundance perspective, stakeholder theory, that movement that I've talking about, that it isn't anymore about just an investor getting a return, but there are multiple stakeholders, and acknowledging that. And I've spoken about our view on the priorities. But with that is the idea of, again, abundance, shared value. And what the corporate citizenship agenda of these great companies are doing is that they link their core business directly to their doing good business. It's not two separate things, it's one agenda. And it's in that core business where they find a way to contribute to making the world a better place. But what more and more companies, and in the book you would see how companies are talking about this, they are also linking that corporate citizen agenda very directly to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They don't go for all 17, they choose 2 or 3 of these goals that they want to make a direct impact on. And then, of course, making that impact from their core business, not as just an add-on or a sort of charity orientation. That's the essence of what is argued around corporate citizenship agenda.
Thanks, Marius, for that. And something that stood out to me is the fact that you speak about how they didn't try and address all the SDGs, and they didn't try and be everything to everyone. They really honed in on 2 and put a lot of effort and energy into doing those things well. So I think back to Prof Smith's comment earlier about doing well by doing good, that ties into that conversation. So I have one question for you, and it's essentially, how did the case study organization in Africa do the following management activities differently by focusing on 4 different areas, being inclusive planning practices, innovative ways of organizing, leading for positive influence and impact, and then finally liberating control practices. So if you like, I know it's quite a mouthful, yes. We can start one by one, and then our panel can interact with you to perform a full picture.
Okay, so on the inclusive planning practices, that's the sort of an extension of the work that I've done on strategy, but it's about opening up strategy. So this thing of that thinking about strategy and planning only for a few exclusive people, is not the practice. And the case study organizations are having various mechanisms to sort of allow people to participate and make strategic contributions. But what is also, it is this, again, the paradox of thinking short term and thinking long term. So Afrimat, Retail Capitals, Safaricom are good examples of where they are creating shorter frequent feedback mechanisms, but that's all done in the light of their sort of purpose, their actual contribution that they want to make over the long term. And it's that tension between long-term intent and short-term progress. Radical simplified budgeting processes as a planning approach. We know that budgeting and planning goes together, and most of you would have scars on budgeting processes, that it's so extensive, and then, so simplified budgeting processes, and VDMV and Prolexis are examples of companies that have radically simplified their budget approach. And then another planning approach is sort of linking planning to learning, to ask continuously the question, what did we learn from what we've done? And Kengen is a good example of that, and also creating a coaching capability for business leaders in the business is a mechanism to work with feedback as a powerful improvement mechanism. So that's planning. Organizing, I mean, the story is on structure. Structures need to be more flat. And that organizing is then supported with a self-management team, decentralized team-based organization patterns, extended network and partnerships, and of course, organizing remote and flexible work practices. Many of these companies have done that before COVID. An example examples of that would be Pralex's, VDMV, Rooftop, Watson Ferguson, and Centum. So that's organizing, but I'm sort of talking fast about these things, but all of them sort of have, but this, the structure needs to be flattened. But it isn't about just a structural intervention, it is about a rethink of how we think about organizing. Because if it's just about the structure, then it's just moving sort of the chairs on the deck of that Titanic. Then leading, we've spoken about leadership, but let me share with you KenGen. It's an energy company in Kenya. On a good day, 90% of the energy that they put into the national grid is green energy. So they are really on the sort of right spectrum of future energy contribution already. It is like our ESCOM, but it's not at all like our ESCOM. It is a listed company on the stock exchange in Kenya. Government still a 70% shareholder, but of course private shareholding, and absolutely managed as a private enterprise. So in my interview with the senior leader, I've asked her, so how do you, being what we would call a state enterprise, how do you handle this continuous potential political interference into the business? And she sat back and looked at me and says, it's interesting that you're asking that question, because on my desk there lies a request from a political person, a parliamentarian. And she sort of had a very sobering, for me, approach and thinking about this. And this is, if we are saying leadership and leading with impact, then this, she says, she's amazed when people get appointed to these senior executive positions in so-called state-owned enterprises. They forget one word. Of course, I ask her, so what is the word? She says, no. It seems as if people forget that they can say no. But she's saying that if you don't have principles that you are following and where you can explain to people why you are saying no, and of course it's also in the way that you say no, it is about keeping the relationship, keeping the communication flow, then people are changing. And she's saying those people eventually becomes your biggest supporter because they know where you start, what's your stance on these things. So this ethical leadership, this sort of standing up for what is right and not being sort of colluded into all other sideshows and sort of preferential treatment of people. This is part of this leadership. And we in South Africa and in Africa should remember that if we talk about the scandals that is showing up, it's always two parties. It's not just the government. It is business in cahoots with government. And so on the leadership, I've seen a lot of sobering approaches and inventions on that. And that's not special gifted people. It's not like it's just people who are very serious and committed to what they are doing. And then lastly, on the control practices, there's a shift from this individual over individual focus on control to teams. and loosening up and empowering teams and putting in advice-based decision-making processes. It is loosening up the control without losing control, and the performance management is also being seen as in this sort of control activities where we control the people. So what the data is showing from this companies is that they are not placing such an emphasis on evaluation. The evaluation is much more a self-evaluation by the individual than this evaluation by others. But what they are emphasizing is they are making time, conscious time, for this development discussion, for this interaction about my performance, and discussions on how can I improve. So it's much more on the conversation for development and improvement than this, oh, did you make the grade or not. The last one on the control practices is that there's a deliberate attempt by these companies to make control more simple and to not have this one rule for everybody, because one person once did a transgression and now everybody is punished under this rule. So a very critical stance on what is being done and can be seen as over control and under empowering of people in their jobs and roles in organizations.
Thanks, Marius. So with that, I think we have a few more minutes before we move into the Q&A, but I just have one final question for our two other panel members. And it's the theme throughout what you've just said for me is that essentially organizations require quite a lot of bravery to make these shifts. And especially when you spoke about with regards to ethics and the shift from being very shareholder-centric to having a more stakeholder-centric and inclusive way of engaging with regards to management practices. So Prof Smith and Dr. Bam, if you don't mind just sharing your closing thoughts, and then we'll move over to Q&A.
So I'll go first, Mark. So just coming off where Marius was now, what I found really useful, Marius, was the practical way the book is presented. And when you come to chapter 9, what interests me, I suppose, was this notion of empowerment and engagement and how one is able to facilitate that and allow that flow of energy, and I just wanted to test with you before it is that you move on to Mark. I found that really simple, a simple thought or approach and a recommendation there to allow people to flow with the energy, and that way one would get the best out of them. Just your thoughts on that particular, the flowing of the energy. I don't necessarily, and my experience might be limited, see that very regularly in organizations, in departments where people are allowed to be creative in that way, to follow the energy, to do the work and deliver with control, I suppose, but in an unrestricted manner.
Look, the ultimate benchmark that we're aiming at is what we call in the book a teal organization with those features. And Armand, what these organizations absolutely do is that they see themselves as part of a system that is a living system. And therefore, sort of breathing is like the oxygen. and they would have as rituals reflection embedded in the sort of practices, check-ins embedded in the practices in very practical ways For instance, when you check in, so what was the significant contribution that you did yesterday? What did you struggle with yesterday? What are you planning for tomorrow? And is there anything that you need help with? Now, those are like 4 very simple sort of rituals, practices, but that sort of create the space for people to work. But the principle of self-organizing and this decentralization of and empowerment of teams, and teams as the engine of performance of these organizations, and multiple teams, and then also mechanisms to coordinate between. That's the hallmark of these so-called teal organizations.
So, Odwa, just before Mark, my last comment, thanks, Marius. Before we move on, I appreciated being able to read a book that had strong theoretical underpinnings, that provided some really solid practical suggestions, and I could see myself on either side of that management equation, being somebody who follows and also somebody who's in roles to lead. So I really appreciated the way it was constructed.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. Thanks. Now I'm regretting agreeing to go second because I was just finished on the point I actually wanted to start with, in this idea of this mix of theory, empirical and practice, because you don't often find books that start with a solid first third where they really do a tour de force of theories in terms of organizations and performance. Sorry, my COVID is kicking in. And then the empirics around what's going on in Africa, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and then practical ideas at the end. But also these practical ideas are kind of throughout as well, because there's sort of references to inventories and self-help that managers can use. Thanks, Simon, for stealing my idea. But it's the thing I wanted to emphasize or to put up on was where Marius finished, actually, is this idea about the teal organization. So for people who know, people who've read this work about reinventing organizations by Frederick Laloux, he talks about different colored organizations, orange, green, red, or orange, green, teal, sorry. And orange being the traditional type of organization, green being those organizations that kind of want to change but are sort of halfway and have many positive aspects, but then teal that are, to pick on what Adwa says, are actually rather courageous in that they've really gone to this self-managing approach, decentralized teams, assessment and evaluation, which is extremely decentralized. And I think the point that it comes back to for me is this idea of courage that Adwa points out, and it underlines that leadership matters, and not leadership in the, again, going back to that hero man or hero great man type idea, but leadership matters throughout the organization, and because it takes maybe a small group of leaders to instill that flat structure and that flexible type of organization, but then it takes people to carry on replicating and leading that. So it's not really a question, but I think that's what I take away from the book, that idea that leadership matters. And there are examples of organizations in green and teal phases, if you like, and I think that's really interesting too. And I would add that as another contribution from this African-based research to what Marius said at the start of based on my first question, is a lot of that research on reinventing organizations has been done out on other continents, and I think it's interesting to juxtapose those teal organizations in Africa and teal organizations elsewhere in the world. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Just to comment on what Armanda said about a leader and a follower, and of course that's one of the paradoxes we all need to sort of accept. We are both leaders and followers, depending on the context. But what this book clearly is saying is that leaders are not more important than followers, and we need. I mean, that's a very powerful departure point. And previously, I still had the sort of impression that, oh, there's leaders and then there's followers, and this is like this followers. in an abundance perspective, in a distributed capacity perspective, in shared leadership, the followers are just as important as the so-called leader group.
Thanks, Marius. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, you've seen that I've posted a message in the chat, so please feel free to share your questions. But Marius, just in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for the questions to come in, a few takeaways from this discussion from my side. So one, the people-centric mentality came through very clearly for me with customers second, because I wouldn't say that that's always been the dominant train of thought if you look at the way a lot of organizations work. So it's a very paradigm shifting way of thinking that makes a lot of sense. And then how that translates to shareholder value. So might not necessarily be instinctive for everybody, but if they really shift the way that they think, they can really it can really transpire to real change. Secondly, you spoke about inclusive strategy, so breaking the hierarchies in terms of strategy formulation. Then you spoke about something that stood out to me personally was making budgeting simple. I think we've all had a few experiences with complicated Excel spreadsheets and lots of iterations, and I like that you spoke about simplicity. People that forget that they can say no. So drawing boundaries and understanding what you're pro and what you're against, instead of allowing things to just transpire and allowing things to happen to you. Then when you were speaking about how certain companies make plans and they put plans in place to cater to their organizations, and you spoke about essentially the concept was you can't cover a gaping hole with a carpet. So looking at what are those fundamental issues as an organization that we need to address. We can't just hand out free food and expect that to fix the issues, but we need to understand what are the critical issues that we need to address. And then ironically, you actually spoke about food. So with that, I see that there's a question that's just popped in the chat from Anita. Did you find any issues regarding kinship in the African context and how people may prefer those that are linked to them via bloodlines marriage instead of choosing the best talent? Very interesting question.
Anita, I can absolutely say that in this data that I've gathered, no evidence of that. And the contrary of that is that merit-based approach is the approach. So looking for talent that fits the requirements for the job. And also with that, not so much high specific criteria on entry, much more on attitude. So select for attitude, and then of course train for and develop for competence. But merit and high expectations, and also what's interesting for me, what I've seen is, especially in Kenya, that a lot of those execs already had a stint in international on other continents, and they've come back to the country to sort of with a very specific purpose to make a change, positive change in the company and through the company to the prosperity of the country. So now I haven't picked up anything around that.
Thanks, Marius. It seems as though we don't have any further questions. It seems that the audience was pretty excited to start purchasing your book. So we'll share the link to the book purchase once more in the chat group. You're welcome to also reach out to our marketing team. We can share more details with regards to where you can get this really insightful book. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you, Prof Ungerer. Thank you, Prof Smith. And thank you, Dr. Bam, for a really engaging discussion. And we hope to see you at the next Leaders Angle that will follow. Have a lovely evening.